The dust of Arizona settled on Jedediah Carter like a second skin, a fine red powder that clung to the sweat on his neck and the weariness in his bones. For 3 days, he had pushed the string of a dozen horses across the sun-baked earth, their hooves kicking up the very land he was trying to leave behind. He was a man carved from the silence of the plains, his words as sparse as the rain in that God-forsaken territory. His face was a map of hard miles, eyes narrowed against a sun that had bleached the sky to a pale, merciless blue. He moved with an economy born of a life where wasted motion could mean the difference between living and dying. The town, if one could call it that, was little more than a scar on the landscape, a single, wide street flanked by a handful of raw lumber buildings, their false fronts leaning like tired old men. It had a name, Purgatory Creek, a place where men came to forget or be forgotten. Jed was there for a simpler reason, coin. The horses were good stock, strong and steady, and the army post a day's ride north paid well. But a man needed a drink first, a real drink, not the brackish water from his canteen. And his throat felt like it was lined with the same dust that covered his boots. He swung down from his saddle, the leather groaning in protest. The horses were secured at the livery, their thirst slaked before his own. That was the code. You took care of your horse before you took care of yourself. With that done, he pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Golden Spur saloon. The air inside was thick and stale, a heavy mix of cheap whiskey, sweat, unlit cigars, and the faint, sweet smell of sawdust meant to soak it all up. A tinny piano plinked out a tune in the corner, played by a man whose face was lost in shadow. Light struggled through the grime-caked windows, illuminating floating dust motes in golden shafts. It was a place Jed knew well. Not this specific saloon, but its every twin in every dusty town from Montana to the Mexican border. They were all the same. A long wooden bar, scarred and stained, stood as an altar where men offered up their pay for a few hours of oblivion. A few tables were scattered about, occupied by grizzled prospectors and weary ranch hands nursing their drinks, their conversations a low, rumbling hum. Jed's spurs chimed softly on the floorboards as he made his way to the bar. He didn't look at the other patrons. Looking invited trouble. And he wasn't here for trouble. He was here to wash the trail from his throat and be on his way. He laid a coin on the bar top, the silver dulled by handling. "Whiskey," he said. The word was rough, unused. The bartender, a large man with a stained apron and an indifferent expression, slid a shot glass toward him and filled it from a bottle with no label. Jed wrapped his calloused fingers around the glass, the solid weight of it a small comfort. He was about to raise it to his lips when his gaze drifted down the length of the bar. And then he saw her. She was standing behind the counter, a ghost in a world of loud, coarse men. She couldn't have been much older than 18, if that. Her dress was a plain, dark color, functional and drab. Yet it couldn't hide the slender line of her neck or the way she held her shoulders squared, as if bracing against a constant, unseen wind. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back severely. But a few stray strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale and serious. She was working, refilling a tray with glasses, her movements precise but strained. A group of 3 men, cattle drivers by the look of their gear, were leaning against the bar near her, their voices loud and slurred. One of them, a thick-set man with a florid face and a week's worth of stubble, reached out and brushed his fingers against her arm as she passed. She flinched. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but Jed saw it. She didn't cry out or pull away. She simply froze for a heartbeat, her back ramrod straight, before continuing to place the glasses on the tray. Her face remained a mask of neutrality, her eyes, a deep, indeterminate color in the dim light, stared straight ahead at the wall of bottles behind the bar. There was no smile, no practiced flirtation, none of the weary coquetry Jed had come to expect from the women who worked these places. Her expression was utterly blank, a closed door, But her hands, as she gripped the edges of the metal tray, trembled. It was a fine, slight tremor, the only sign of the storm raging beneath the calm surface. Jed had seen 100 girls like her, girls swept up by bad luck or bad choices, serving drinks to men who looked at them as just another commodity to be bought and sold for the night. They learned quickly to build walls around themselves, to smile when it was required, to endure the casual pause and crude remarks. It was part of the job, part of the life. He felt a familiar, dull ache of pity, the kind a man feels for a lame horse he knows will be put down. It was a shame, but it was the way of things. He had his own path to walk, and it didn't involve straying for the sake of a saloon girl with sad eyes. He picked up his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. He was a man who minded his own affairs. He'd learned long ago that the world was full of sorrows you couldn't fix, and trying only got you tangled in a rope not of your own making. He would drink his whiskey, feel its burn, and walk back out into the clean, honest sun. He would sell his horses and ride on. Her fate was not his concern. He turned his head, ready to face the room, to put her out of his mind. But in that instant, she looked up. Her eyes met his across the crowded, noisy room. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a challenge. It was something else entirely, something that cut through the noise and the smoke and struck him with the force of a physical blow. In her gaze, there was no fear of the men beside her, no plea for a gallant rescue. There was only a raw, desperate yearning. It was the look of someone drowning, not begging for a hand, but simply hoping that someone, anyone, would see that the water was over their head, that they were real, that they existed beyond the stained fabric of their dress and the whiskey they were paid to pour. The world seemed to fall away. The piano music faded. The low drone of conversation ceased. There was only the vast, silent distance between them, bridged by a look that asked for nothing and everything all at once. Jed's hand, holding the whiskey glass, froze halfway to his mouth. The hardness in his chest, the calloused shield he'd built around his heart over years of solitary wandering, felt a strange and unwelcome crack. He saw the thick-set man lean in again, his voice a greasy whisper in her ear. She didn't look away from Jed. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jed lowered his glass back to the bar, the click of it against the wood unnaturally loud in his own ears. He kept his eyes on hers. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a simple acknowledgement. "I see you." A flicker of something, was it relief, surprise, passed through her eyes before she broke the contact, turning to answer the bartender who had barked an order at her. The moment was over. The saloon roared back to life around him, but something had shifted. The dust in his throat was still there, but now there was a different kind of dryness, a different kind of thirst. He stayed longer than he'd intended. He nursed that first whiskey, then ordered a second. He watched. He watched her move with a quiet grace behind the bar, a small, still point in a chaotic world. He watched the owner, a man with oily hair and eyes that followed her every move, never straying for long. He saw how she anticipated orders, how she avoided brushing against the reaching hands, how she made herself smaller, trying to become invisible. She was a master of evasion, a phantom in her own life. Jed understood hiding. He'd spent most of his life doing it, not behind a bar, but in the wide-open spaces, hiding from a past that was always a day's ride behind him. He recognized the look of a cornered animal, not a wild one, but a doe caught in a trap, waiting for the hunter to return. As the evening wore on, the thick-set man and his friends grew louder, their advances more insistent. Finally, the man reached out and grabbed her wrist as she came to collect their empty glasses. "Come on, sweetheart," he slurred, pulling her toward him. "Stop being so standoffish. Share a drink with us." Her body went rigid. "Please, sir, I'm working." Her voice was low, devoid of emotion, but the tremor in her hands had returned, shaking the tray she held. Jed pushed himself off the bar. He didn't stride over, didn't make a scene. He just moved, a silent shadow detaching from the wall. He came to stand beside the man, his presence a sudden, cold weight. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the man's hand on the girl's wrist. His own hand rested near the worn leather grip of the Colt on his hip. The man looked up, his liquor-fueled confidence faltering as he met Jed's gaze. Jed's eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and hard and promising nothing good. After a long moment, the man's grip loosened. He grumbled something under his breath and released her, turning back to his friends with a dismissive wave. She pulled her hand back as if it had been burned. She gathered the glasses, her head bowed. For a moment, Jed thought she would just walk away, that the silent transaction was complete. But she hesitated. She took a step closer to him, so close he could smell the faint scent of soap that clung to her, a clean smell utterly out of place in the grimy saloon. She kept her eyes down, speaking to the floorboards. Her voice was a whisper, a sound meant only for him, lost to the rest of the room. "I don't belong here." He waited. He knew there was more. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes found his again. The desperation was back, raw and unfiltered. "I'm just hiding." His gaze held hers for a fraction of a second longer, a silent acknowledgement that he had heard, truly heard. The words beneath the words. The noise of the saloon was a distant storm, and in the eye of it was this girl, this stranger, who had just handed him a piece of her broken world. He gave a short, almost imperceptible jerk of his head toward the back of the saloon, where a narrow door led to a supply room and the alley beyond. It was an instinct, a need to take this conversation out of the oppressive air, away from the hungry eyes of the room. She understood immediately, with a final, nervous glance at the bar owner. Silas Croft, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. She picked up an empty crate. It was her excuse. Jed turned and ambled toward the door, his movements casual, betraying none of the sudden tension coiling in his gut. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool evening air. The alley was a narrow channel between the saloon and the assayer's office, cluttered with barrels and smelling of sour mash and dust. The last vestiges of daylight painted the tops of the false front buildings across the street in hues of orange and purple. But down here, in the canyon between walls, the shadows were deep and absolute. A moment later, the door creaked open and she slipped out, setting the crate down with a soft thud. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that was less about the chill and more about holding herself together. In the dim light, he could see the details of her face more clearly, the fine line of her jaw, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose that the saloon's gloom had hidden. She was younger than he'd first thought. The weariness in her eyes belonged to someone twice her age, but the face itself was still soft with youth, untouched by the harsh lines of time and bitterness. "They call me Mercy," she said, her voice still a whisper, as if the alley walls had ears. The name landed strangely in the quiet space between them. Mercy. It was a word from a different world, a world of hymnals and Sunday mornings, not back alleys and whiskey-soaked floorboards. Jedediah had known women named Mary, Sarah, and Clementine. He had never met a Mercy. He imagined it was a name her mother had given her, a prayer for a life she would never have. He didn't offer his own name. Names were anchors, and he preferred to drift. He simply waited, his back against the rough, splintered wood of the saloon wall, letting the silence ask the questions for him. "My father," she began, her eyes fixed on a loose stone on the ground. "He came here chasing gold, like everyone else. He was a good man, but he was a dreamer. He saw fortunes in every rock." She paused, swallowing hard. "He borrowed money from Mr. Croft to fund his last expedition. For tools, a mule, supplies. He signed a paper." Jed knew about those papers. They were ironclad, written in a language that always favored the lender, trapping the desperate in nets of ink and obligation. He went into the Superstition Mountains, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. He never came back. A prospector found his mule a month later. That was all. Mr. Croft. He was patient at first. Then he came to the boarding house where I was staying. He showed me the paper. The debt was considerable. I had nothing, no family to send for. My mother passed when I was a girl. She finally looked up at him, and the blank mask she wore inside the saloon was gone. Here, in the shadows, her face was a canvas of fear and exhaustion. Mr. Croft said I could work it off. He said he needed help behind the bar. He gave me a room upstairs. He said it was a fair arrangement. Jed's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what kind of fair arrangement Silas Croft offered. The room upstairs wasn't an act of charity. It was a cage, placed conveniently close to the keeper. He'd seen Croft watching her all night, his gaze proprietary, like a man looking over a horse he was about to break. "He's been waiting," Mercy whispered, the word itself seeming to leave a foul taste in her mouth. "He says the debt is more than just pouring drinks. He says a girl as pretty as me has other ways to show her gratitude. Every night, I bar my door. I pile the chair and the dresser against it. Some nights he jiggles the handle. He calls my name through the wood." She shuddered, a violent tremor that shook her entire frame. "He says he owns me, that the paper my father signed gave him the right." Jed's hand, of its own accord, drifted down to rest on the butt of his pistol. It wasn't a conscious threat, just a familiar weight, a cold piece of steel that made more sense to him than the messy, cruel world of men like Croft. He thought of the tremor in her hands when she held the tray, and now he understood. It wasn't nervousness. It was the constant, vibrating terror of a trapped bird listening to the footsteps of the cat. "He told me this morning that he's tired of waiting," she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in slightly to hear her. "A man is coming through town at the end of the week. A man named Flannery, who runs a silver mine up north, a place with no women. Mr. Croft has arranged to sell him my debt, to sell me. He said Flannery will know how to collect the full amount. He said I'll be gone. Permanently." The word hung in the air. Permanently. It was a death sentence of a different kind. Jed had heard stories of the northern mining camps, isolated, lawless places where a woman's life was worth less than a pouch of silver dust. She would be passed from man to man until she was used up, a broken thing left to fade in the unforgiving wilderness. A profound and heavy stillness settled over Jed. He looked at this girl, Mercy, who stood before him, her life balanced on the edge of a razor. He saw not a saloon girl, not a problem, but a person stripped of every choice, staring into an abyss. The weariness he'd felt from the trail was nothing compared to the exhaustion he saw in her soul. He felt his own carefully constructed solitude, the quiet peace of his lonely life, begin to crumble. A part of him, the sensible part that had kept him alive for 30 years, screamed at him to turn around, to walk back into the saloon, finish his drink, and ride out at dawn. This was not his fight. This was not his trouble. But then she spoke again, and her final words were not a plea for help, but a quiet, desperate statement of what she was about to lose. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever heard, a secret whispered into the encroaching darkness. Her gaze met his, clear and unwavering, and in their depths he saw a flicker of the girl she was supposed to be, the one who hadn't been orphaned and sold and threatened. "I've never been kissed, sir," she whispered, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "I've never done anything, and I don't want my first to be with the man who buys me." Jedediah Carter's heart, a thing he'd long considered to be as tough and unyielding as saddle leather, sank in his chest. It was a physical sensation, a sudden, leaden weight that pulled him down, rooting him to that spot in the filthy alley. He felt the vast, empty plains, the silent canyons, and the cold, Distant stars, the very things that had always been his refuge, receding from him. In their place was the face of this girl, her quiet dignity, and a choice he knew, with dreadful certainty, that he was going to have to make. The simple act of buying a drink had just become the most complicated thing he had ever done. The single tear that traced a path through the grime on her cheek was an indictment of the entire dusty, God-forsaken town. It was a silent testament to a world that took and took, leaving nothing but hollowed-out spaces where dreams were supposed to grow. Jedediah Carter had seen his share of tears in his life, angry tears, drunken tears, tears of grief, but this was different. This was the quiet grief for something that had never even been allowed to exist. Mercy did not wipe the tear away. She let it fall, a final, liquid confession into the dirt of the alley. Her gaze remained locked on his, the last ember of hope in her holding on against a gale of despair. "Help me," she whispered, and the two words were heavier than any chain. "Take me with you, anywhere. I don't care where." She wasn't asking for a night on a white horse. She was asking for a ghost to help her disappear. Jed's mind was a maelstrom of silence. Every instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of solitary survival, screamed at him to back away. This was not his business. He owed this girl nothing. He was a passer-through, a man who sold horses and moved on, leaving no tracks. To take her would be to take on her trouble, to paint a target on his own back. Silas Croft was not the kind of man to let a valuable piece of property just walk away. And the man from the silver mine, Flannery, would likely be even worse. This was an invitation to a fight he hadn't picked, a storm he hadn't seen coming. He looked past her, through the open doorway and into the yellow, smoky light of the Golden Spur. He saw the leering faces, heard the coarse laughter. He saw the life she was living, the life that was about to be stolen from her in a far more permanent way. And he contrasted it with his own. His life was hard. Yes, it was lonely. But it was free. He chose which trail to ride, where to make his camp, when to face the sunrise. His solitude was a fortress he had built for himself. Hers was a prison. His gaze returned to her face. He saw the fine tremor in her lip, the desperate courage it took for her to stand there and ask a complete stranger to save her life. He thought of the way her hands had shaken on the tray, and the way she had flinched but not cried out when the cattle driver had grabbed her. She was a sapling in a rock slide, slender and fragile but refusing to snap. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, each second a stone dropping into a deep well. Mercy's expression began to falter. The light in her eyes flickered, the hope draining away, replaced by the dull, familiar sheen of resignation. She thought he was refusing. She had laid her soul bare, and he was going to turn his back on it. Her shoulders slumped, and she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of defeat, as if to say, "Of course, why would you?" She started to turn away, to retreat back into the cage. Jed pushed himself off the wall. The movement was sudden, economical. He walked past her, back into the saloon, without a word. The door swung shut behind him, leaving her alone in the deepening dark. For a moment, she stood frozen, the coldness in the alley seeping into her bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was over. That was her last chance, and it had vanished. Inside, Jed walked back to his spot at the bar. He ignored the bartender's questioning glance. He picked up the shot glass of whiskey he had abandoned earlier. The amber liquid was untouched. He held it for a long second, his knuckles white. Then, with a slow, deliberate finality, he set the glass back down on the scarred wood of the bar top. The sound a dull thud that sealed a pact only two people in the world understood. He turned his head slightly. Mercy had just slipped back inside, her face pale, her movements wooden as she went to retrieve an empty bucket. Her eyes, filled with a renewed and fragile hope, darted toward him. He met her gaze across the room. He lifted his hand, 2 fingers pointing to his own eyes. A silent "watch me." Then he tilted his head back, his gaze tracking an imaginary path across the ceiling to where the moon would be at its zenith. He held his gaze there for a beat, then looked back at her. Midnight. A wave of understanding, so powerful it was almost dizzying, washed over her. Her breath caught in her throat. She gave a single, sharp nod, so small that anyone else would have missed it, before turning away to her work, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The next few hours were the longest of Jedediah Carter's life. He took a table in the darkest corner of the room, ordered a beer he didn't drink, and settled in to wait. He became part of the shadows, a silent observer. From his vantage point, he watched the saloon's ecosystem. He watched Silas Croft, who moved with a predator's greasy confidence, his eyes constantly flicking toward Mercy. Jed clocked the pistol Croft wore tucked into his waistband at the small of his back. He noted the 2 brutish men who served as Croft's muscle, men who drank for free and watched the doors. He mapped the town in his head, the livery stable at the far end of the street, the alleyways behind the buildings, the open stretch of land to the south that led into the broken country of the foothills. He was no longer just a horse trader. He was a strategist. Every detail, every possibility, was turned over and examined in the quiet forge of his mind. Across the room, Mercy worked. No one could have guessed the monumental secret she now carried. She moved with the same practiced efficiency, her face the same neutral mask. But Jed saw the difference. He saw the new tension in her shoulders, the way she would subtly glance toward the grimy window to check the position of the stars. Their shared secret was a live wire stretching between them in the smoky air, invisible and humming with a dangerous energy. Once, when she brought a bottle to a nearby table, her eyes met his for a bare second. There was no fear in them now. There was only a terrifying, resolute trust. Finally, the saloon began to empty. The piano player closed the lid over the keys with a weary sigh. The prospectors and ranch hands shuffled out, their coins spent, their brief escape from reality over. Croft's men bolted the front doors. Croft himself counted the day's takings, his back to the room. Jed stood up. His chair scraped softly against the floorboards. Croft turned, a flicker of annoyance on his face. "We're closed, Cowboy." Jed just nodded, dropped a coin for the beer on the table, and walked toward the back door, the one that led to the alley. It was the same door Mercy used. Croft watched him go. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, but said nothing more. Jed stepped out into the night. The moon was high and bright, a silver coin nailed to a black velvet sky. It bleached the dust to a ghostly white and cast long, sharp shadows. The air was cold and clean. Jed moved swiftly, his spurs making no sound as he kept to the softest parts of the alley. He made his way to the livery. The stableman was asleep on a cot, snoring softly. Jed moved like a phantom past him. He went straight to his own horse, a powerful buckskin named Apollo. The horse nickered softly as Jed approached. Recognizing his scent, Jed saddled him with practiced, efficient movements, his hands finding every buckle and strap in the dark. He checked the cinch, tightened it, and slipped the bridle over the horse's head. He untied the reins of the other 11 horses. They wouldn't follow, but a loose herd would create confusion if anyone came looking. He led Apollo out of the stable and into the shadows behind the building, waiting. Minutes later, the back door of the saloon creaked open. Mercy slipped out, a small, dark shape against the faint light from within. She carried a small bundle tied up in a piece of cloth. She saw him in the shadows and hurried forward, her steps light and silent. She stopped in front of him, her face upturned in the moonlight, her breath pluming in the cold air. There was no time for words. He put a finger to his lips, then swung himself up into the saddle. He reached down a hand for her. She placed her small, trembling hand in his, and he pulled her up behind him with an easy strength. She landed softly on the horse's rump, her body pressed against his back. "Hold on," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken to her since the alley. His voice was a low rumble. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her fingers clutching the rough fabric of his shirt. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his back. He urged Apollo forward, keeping the horse to a slow, silent walk through the warren of back alleys, away from the main street. They moved like ghosts through the sleeping town. They cleared the last building, the open desert stretching out before them under the immense, star-dusted sky. Jed could feel the tension in Mercy's grip. This was it, the moment of freedom. He gently nudged Apollo's flanks, and the horse broke into a smooth, ground-eating canter. The wind picked up, cool and fresh, whipping strands of her hair against his neck. For a few glorious minutes, there was only the sound of the hooves on the hard-packed earth, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the wind. They were flying through the silvered landscape, leaving Purgatory Creek and its darkness behind them. Then, a shout cut through the night. "Hey, stop!" A rectangle of yellow light suddenly appeared as the saloon's front door was thrown open. A figure was silhouetted against it. Jed didn't need to look back. He leaned forward, whispering a command into Apollo's ear, and the horse surged forward, stretching into a full gallop. Another shout, this one filled with rage. It was Croft's voice. A second later, the night was shattered by the sharp crack of a gunshot. A flash of orange bloomed in the darkness behind them. Mercy gasped, her arms tightening around him until he could barely breathe. Whiz! A bullet sang past his ear, a deadly hornet in the night. Hoofbeats thundered behind them. Two riders, Croft and one of his men. They were closing the distance. Jed didn't panic. He was a man who knew horses and he knew the land. He veered Apollo sharply to the right, heading for a series of low, rocky buttes that rose like jagged teeth from the desert floor. It was rougher ground, dangerous in the dark, but it offered cover. Another shot rang out, and this time Jed felt a sharp tug at his sleeve. The bullet had torn through the fabric of his shirt. Mercy cried out, a small, terrified sound. "Keep your head down," he grunted, his voice tight. He urged the powerful buckskin on, weaving through the maze of rock and shadow. Apollo was sure-footed, a creature born of this harsh land, responding to Jed's every subtle command. The sound of their pursuers' hoofbeats grew slightly fainter as the treacherous terrain slowed them down. But they were still there, still coming. Jed pushed on, deeper into the darkness, the girl clinging to his back, the gunshots echoing behind them like the wrath of a god they had just defied. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were fugitives, and the long, dark night had only just begun. He rode with a grim purpose, becoming one with the horse beneath him. The buckskin, Apollo, was a force of nature, his powerful lungs pumping like bellows, his hooves striking sparks from the flinty ground. Jed knew this land. He had crossed it a dozen times, and its unforgiving contours were etched into his memory. He wasn't just running. He was leading his pursuers into a trap made of rock and shadow. He pushed Apollo up a steep, scree-covered slope, a path no sane man would take at a gallop in the dead of night. Rocks dislodged by the horse's frantic climb tumbled down behind them, a miniature avalanche in their wake. He heard a curse and the terrified whinny of a horse from below. He glanced back for a split second and saw one of the riders struggling to control his panicked mount. They were losing ground. Mercy clung to him, her face buried in his back. He could feel her trembling with every jarring impact, but she made no sound. She had placed her life entirely in his hands, a burden of trust that felt heavier than any saddle pack he had ever carried. He felt a surge of something fierce and protective, an unfamiliar fire in his gut. He would not let them take her. He crested the ridge and plunged the horse down the other side, into a narrow, winding arroyo. The dry riverbed was a natural pathway, its high walls swallowing the moonlight and cloaking them in near-total darkness. The air grew colder here, and the only sound was Apollo's ragged breathing and the soft crunch of sand under his hooves. The sounds of pursuit faded, muffled by the stone walls. They were safe. for now. He didn't slow down for another mile, letting the powerful horse carry them deeper into the labyrinth of the Badlands. He followed the arroyo until it opened into a small, box canyon, a dead end to anyone who didn't know the secret it held. Tucked into the far wall, almost perfectly concealed by a recent rockfall and a clutch of hardy, skeletal mesquite, was the dark mouth of a shallow cave. It was a place he'd used before to wait out a sandstorm. It was small, barely a hollow in the rock, but it was defensible and hidden. He finally pulled Apollo to a halt. The horse stood trembling, his hide slick with sweat, his flanks heaving. Jed swung down from the saddle, his own legs unsteady for a moment. He reached up for Mercy. "We're here," he said, his voice a low rasp. She slid down into his arms, her body limp with exhaustion and relief. She was so light he barely felt her weight. For a moment, she sagged against him, and he stood still, his hands resting on her waist. A brief, awkward island of human contact in the vast, silent wilderness. Then she straightened, pulling away, and wrapped her arms around herself. The adrenaline that had kept her warm was fading, and the desert night was sinking its teeth into her. A violent shiver racked her body. Jed turned his attention to the horse, his movements all business. He unsaddled Apollo, checked his legs for injury, and wiped him down with a handful of dry grass he pulled from a clump near the cave entrance. He spoke to the animal in a low, soothing murmur, the words he couldn't seem to find for the girl. When he was done, he hobbled the horse, leaving him to graze on the sparse vegetation in the canyon. Only then did he turn back to Mercy. She was huddled just inside the cave's entrance, a small, forlorn shape in the gloom. Her teeth were chattering audibly. The thin dress she wore offered no protection against the cold that seeped from the rocks. Without a word, Jed shrugged out of his heavy canvas coat. It was worn and smelled of dust, horse, and the faint scent of wood smoke, the scent of his life. He walked over and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her. The sleeves hung far past her hands, and the collar came up to her ears. But the residual warmth of his body clung to the fabric. She pulled it tighter around herself, burying her face in the rough material for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled. He grunted in reply and set about making a fire. He was a man who found comfort in tasks, in the simple, logical progression of work. He gathered dry twigs and brittle brush from the base of the canyon walls, his eyes constantly scanning the ridge above them, listening to the silence of the night. He built the fire just inside the mouth of the cave, where the smoke would be mostly obscured by the overhang and the light would not be visible from the trail. He struck a match, and the tiny flame bloomed to life, a fragile miracle in the darkness. He nurtured it carefully, adding larger sticks until a small, steady fire crackled, pushing back the oppressive dark and casting flickering, dancing shadows on the cave walls. The warmth began to fill their small shelter. He sat down on the other side of the fire, his back against the rock wall. He drew his knees up and rested his forearms on them, his hands hanging loose. He stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the snap and hiss of the fire and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. The heat slowly seeped into Mercy's bones, chasing away the worst of the chill. The violent shivers subsided into a slight tremor. She pulled the coat tighter, the unfamiliar weight of it a strange comfort. She watched him across the small blaze. The firelight carved his face from the shadows, highlighting the hard line of his jaw, the straight bridge of his nose, and the weariness that had settled deep in the corners of his eyes. He was a stranger, a man who had not even told her his name. Yet, in the space of a few hours, he had become her entire world, her only shield against the darkness. She had to tell him. She had to make him understand that he hadn't saved a whore from a brothel. He had saved a girl. It mattered. To her, it mattered more than anything. It was the only thing of value she had left to her name. This truth she had guarded so fiercely. She moved from her spot, crawling on her hands and knees around the edge of the fire until she was sitting beside him. She was close, but not touching. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head. He continued to stare into the flames as if he were alone. She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible, and wrapped his big coat around her like a cocoon. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the things they hadn't said, the questions he hadn't asked, and the stories she hadn't told. He was giving her the space to speak, or to remain silent. The choice was hers. She took a shaky breath. "In the saloon," she began, her voice barely more than a dry rustle of leaves. "The way those men look at you, the way Mr. Croft looked at me. They think they know what you are just by where you are. They think because a girl works in a place like that, she must be—" She trailed off, unable to say the word. Jed still didn't look at her, but she saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He was listening. "My father, before he died, he always told me that your honor is the one thing no one can take from you. You can only give it away. I never forgot that." She hugged her legs tighter. "Mr. Croft. He took everything else. My home, my freedom. He tried to take that, too. He thought he could. He thought it was just part of the price, part of the debt." She finally found the courage to say what she needed to say. She turned her head and spoke to his profile, to the hard line of his jaw illuminated by the fire. Her voice was a thread of sound, raw and vulnerable, meant only for him and the ancient stones of the cave. "I'm a virgin," she whispered, "though everyone thinks otherwise." The words hung in the air, simple and stark and carrying the weight of her entire life. It was a confession, a declaration, and a plea all at once. "See me, see who I really am." For a long moment, Jedediah Carter did not react. He remained perfectly still, a man carved from the same rock as the cave they were in. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks into the air. The coyote called again, closer this time, to an outside observer. It would have seemed as if he hadn't heard her, or that her words meant nothing to him. But Mercy saw it. She saw his right hand, which had been resting loosely on his thigh near the hilt of the large Bowie knife sheathed at his belt, slowly clench into a fist. His knuckles turned white. His thumb pressed down hard on the staghorn grip of the knife. It wasn't a move of aggression toward her. It was an act of immense, internal control, as if he were gripping an anchor in a raging sea. It was as if her whispered words had unleashed something inside him, a fury so profound that he had to physically hold it back, to keep it from consuming him. He was holding onto the knife not to draw it, but to stop himself from doing something else, from shattering the stillness of the night with a roar of pure, untamed rage at a world that could take a girl like her and try to grind her into dust. He did not look at her. He couldn't, because if he did, she might see the storm that had just broken loose behind his cold, winter sky eyes. The fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers by the time the first pale light of dawn crept over the canyon rim, turning the black rock to a bruised purple. Jed was already awake. Mercy didn't know if he had slept at all. He was standing at the mouth of the cave, a silent silhouette against the burgeoning day, his gaze fixed on the vast, empty horizon. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire being, to the language of the wilderness. Her confession from the night before lay between them, an unspoken and unacknowledged truth. He had not mentioned it, and his face gave no indication that he had even heard it, save for the memory of his hand tightening on the hilt of his knife. The silence he offered was a strange gift. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of space. In his silence, she was not judged, not questioned, not pitied. She simply was. He turned from his vigil, his eyes meeting hers briefly in the dim light. There was no softness in his gaze, but there was a new kind of gravity. He had made a choice in that alley, and now the consequences of it were real, illuminated by the rising sun. They were two fugitives in a land that offered no quarter. "We need water," he said, his voice a low rasp, cutting through the morning stillness. That was how their new life began. Not with grand pronouncements or plans, but with the simple, brutal necessities of survival. He took his canteen and a water skin from his saddlebags and gestured for her to follow. He led her not out of the canyon, but further in, to a place where a dark stain ran down the rock face, and a few stubborn green ferns clung to life in a crevice. He didn't explain the theory of geology or botany. He showed her. He pointed to the plants. Where these grow, there's water close. He began to dig at the base of the rock with his hands, scooping away the sand and loose gravel. After a few minutes of steady work, the sand grew dark and damp. Slowly, miraculously, a small puddle of cloudy water began to seep into the hole he had made. He let it settle, then carefully filled the water skin, then the canteen. He drank first a short, quick swallow, then handed the canteen to her. The water was cool and tasted of stone and earth. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and their needs. The past was a ghost they did not speak of. The future was a cliff edge they dared not look over. There was only the present moment, the task at hand. The world shrank to the size of their small canyon, to the crackle of the fire, to the search for food and water. Jed was a creature of this environment. He moved with a quiet economy, his senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, the faintest track in the dust. The first afternoon, he returned from a silent foray with 2 jackrabbits, their long ears limp. Mercy watched, her stomach churning, as he skinned and cleaned them with a swift, practiced efficiency that was neither cruel nor gentle, but simply necessary. He cooked the meat on sharpened sticks over the fire, and when it was done, he handed her a piece without a word. It was tough and gamey, but it was sustenance. It was life. He began to teach her, not with lectures, but with demonstrations. His lessons were lessons in silence. One afternoon, he scattered the fire she had been tending, much to her alarm. Then, he knelt and gestured for her to watch. He gathered a small bundle of the driest, finest grass. Like a bird building a nest, he showed her how to shave thin, feathery curls from a piece of dry wood with his knife. This was the tinder, the heart of the fire. He arranged the kindling, small twigs no thicker than her finger, in a small cone over it. Only then did he strike a match. He cupped his hands around the tiny flame, protecting it, coaxing it, until it licked at the tinder and took hold. He looked at her, then pointed to the woodpile. Her turn. Her first attempts were clumsy failures. Her tinder was too damp, her kindling too thick. The smoke she produced was acrid and discouraging. Her hands, accustomed to the smooth handles of glasses and trays, felt awkward and useless. But Jed was patient. He wouldn't do it for her. He would simply point, a silent finger indicating a better piece of wood, a drier patch of grass. On the third try, a small, wavering flame finally caught. It was a weak and fragile thing, but it was hers. She looked up at him, her face smudged with soot, and saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't praise, not exactly. It was a nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. He taught her about the horse. Apollo was not just a means of transport. He was their partner, their lifeline. He showed her how to brush the dust from the buckskin's coat, how to check his hooves for stones, how to lead him to water. He taught her a single knot, a quick release knot to tether the horse. He made her tie it and untie it, over and over again, until her fingers learned the rhythm of the rope and could do it in the dark. As she worked, she began to feel a connection to the large, gentle animal. He would nuzzle her shoulder, his breath warm, and she would whisper to him, telling him the things she could not say to the man who watched from a distance. The most difficult lesson was the knife. One evening, as dusk settled, he drew the large Bowie knife from its sheath. The firelight glinted on the long, heavy blade. He held it out to her. Handle first. She hesitated, her hands recoiling. The only knives she had ever used were for peeling potatoes in the saloon's kitchen. "Take it," he said. His voice was flat, without inflection. She reached out with a trembling hand and took it. The weight of it surprised her, a solid, deadly weight that seemed to have a life of its own. Her fingers felt small and weak around the staghorn grip. "It's not a toy," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's a tool. It can save your life." He stood up and moved behind her, his presence a warm shadow at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. He guided her hand, his voice a murmur near her ear. "Hold it firm. Your thumb along the back. Good. Now, if someone grabs you..." He moved in front of her, playing the part of an attacker. He showed her a simple, brutal movement, not a wild slash, but a short, sharp thrust aimed at the soft places of a man's body. They practiced the movement in slow motion, again and again. He was a patient teacher, correcting her grip, the angle of her wrist, her footing. He was teaching her how to be dangerous. He was giving her back a piece of the power that had been stolen from her. As she went through the motions, something inside her began to shift. The fear that had been her constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She hoped she would never have to use this lesson, but knowing that she could, that she was not entirely defenseless, was like taking her first breath after being underwater for too long. In all this time, they rarely spoke of anything personal. He was Jed. She was Mercy. That was the extent of their shared history. He never asked about her father, or her life before Purgatory Creek, and she never asked where he came from, or where he was going. Their conversation was the functional language of survival. "The water is low. We need more wood. Did you hear that?" But in the quiet spaces between the lessons, Mercy watched him. When he was cleaning his pistol, his movements precise and methodical. When he was staring into the fire, his face lost in thoughts she couldn't begin to guess at. When he stood on the ridge at dawn and dusk, a lonely sentinel guarding their temporary world, she watched the way he moved, with a predator's grace and a deep, ingrained stillness. She saw the lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes, lines that had been there long before he ever met her. She noticed the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and wondered how he had gotten it. She memorized the shape of his hands, calloused and capable, yet surprisingly gentle when he checked Apollo's leg for a thorn. She was drawing a map of him in her mind, charting the unknown territory of the man who had saved her. He was a mystery, a fortress of silence, but every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of the man inside, a moment when his eyes would soften as he watched a lizard scurry across a rock, or the ghost of a smile that touched his lips when Apollo nudged him for a piece of dried apple he kept in his pocket. She hoarded these small moments like precious gems. Each one was a brushstroke in the portrait of him that she was painting in her memory. He had asked for nothing from her, not even her story. He had simply acted, and in his silent, steady presence, in his patient lessons, in the simple act of draping his coat over her shoulders that first night, he had shown her more kindness than she had known in years. She didn't know his past, and she couldn't guess at their future. All she knew was that whenever he turned his back, she would look at him and feel a painful, burgeoning gratitude that was so profound. It felt almost like hope. For 3 days, they lived in the pocket of the canyon, a world measured in a few hundred square yards of rock and sand. Jed continued to push south, but their progress was slow and deliberate. He avoided the open trails, keeping to the broken country, the places where a man on a good horse could disappear. He was erasing their tracks, not just from Croft, but from the world itself. On the 4th day, he reined Apollo in at the top of a high mesa and scanned the horizon. The sky to the north, the direction from which they had come, was a clean, empty blue. But to the west, something was wrong. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly yellow along the horizon, and the clouds gathered above it were not the fluffy, aimless clouds of a summer afternoon. these were different. They were thick and dark, moving with a purpose, their underbellies a churning slate gray. Jed sniffed the air. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a strange, metallic scent, the smell of ozone and distant rain. The air grew heavy, still and unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. "Storm's coming," he said, the words clipped, a bad one. Mercy looked at the sky, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "What do we do?" "We ride," he said, turning Apollo's head southeast, toward a line of dark, timber-covered hills. "We need to find cover, real cover. A cave won't be enough for this." There was no more time for lessons. He set a hard, punishing pace, and she held on, her body accustomed now to the rhythm of the horse. The landscape changed, the red rock and sparse brush giving way to stands of pinon pine and juniper. The sun disappeared behind the advancing wall of cloud, and the world was plunged into a strange, premature twilight. The wind began to moan through the trees, a low, mournful sound that set Mercy's teeth on edge. The first drop of rain was a cold, fat splash against her cheek, then another and another. Within minutes, the heavens opened. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of cold water that soaked them to the skin in seconds. It came down with such force that it churned the dusty ground into a thick, red mud that sucked at Apollo's hooves. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion of sound that made the very air vibrate. Apollo shied, tossing his head, and Jed fought to keep him under control, his voice a low, steady murmur in the horse's ear. They were blind, half drowned, in a world that had dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. Jed leaned low over the horse's neck, his hat pulled down, his eyes narrowed to slits as he searched for any sign of shelter. Mercy buried her face in his back, the worn fabric of his shirt offering no protection, her body beginning to shake with a deep, penetrating cold. Just when she thought she could not endure it another moment, that her numb fingers would lose their grip and she would slide off into the mud, Jed gave a low shout. He urged Apollo through a thick stand of dripping pines, and she saw what he had seen, a dark, unnatural shape against the gray gloom. A cabin. It was a derelict thing, a forgotten remnant of some long-dead prospector's dashed hopes. It was built of rough-hewn logs, now gray and rotting. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye, its glass long gone, but it had 4 walls and the semblance of a roof. It was a haven. Jed slid from the saddle and practically lifted her down, her legs too numb to hold her. He led Apollo under the partial shelter of the porch roof, then pushed open the cabin's door, which sagged on one leather hinge. The air that rushed out was stale and musty, the smell of decay and forgotten things. He led her inside. It was a single, small room, darker than the storm outside. What little light filtered through the doorway and the empty window revealed a floor of packed earth, a rusted, pot-bellied stove in one corner, and a crude table tilted on 3 legs. The wind howled through the gaps in the chinking between the logs, and water dripped steadily from at least 3 different places in the roof. But they were out of the driving rain. "Stay here," Jed commanded, and went back outside. A few minutes later, he returned with their saddlebags and his bedroll, all soaked. He had taken the saddle off Apollo and left him tethered but free to move on the porch. His first priority, as always, was fire. He found a small stack of wood next to the stove, miraculously dry. With the same focused intensity she had come to know, he set about coaxing a flame to life in the stove's rusted belly. Soon, a weak but welcome warmth began to radiate into the small room, and the smoke, instead of filling the cabin, found its way up the crooked stovepipe. The small fire was a fragile bastion against the cold and the storm that raged outside. The rain hammered on the roof, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Mercy huddled as close to the stove as she dared, but she couldn't stop shivering. Her dress was plastered to her skin, and the cold had settled deep in her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Jed stripped the wet blanket from his bedroll and hung it over the back of a broken chair near the stove. He looked at her, at the way her small body was racked with uncontrollable tremors. He hesitated. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, his face a mask of indecision. The careful distance he had maintained between them, the unspoken rules of their strange coexistence, were being challenged by the simple, brutal fact of her suffering. With a quiet sigh of resignation, he unrolled his remaining dry blanket and his heavy canvas coat and laid them on the driest patch of floor he could find, not far from the stove. He arranged them into a makeshift bed. He didn't look at her. He spoke to the floor. "Lie down. You need to get warm." She looked at the pallet he had made. It was close to where he would have to sleep. Too close. But the shivering was getting worse, blurring her vision. She moved stiffly, her limbs refusing to obey, and lowered herself onto the coat. Its rough texture was a comfort. She pulled the wool blanket over herself, curling into a tight ball. But it did little to stop the shaking. The cold was inside her now. Jed sat down on the other side of the stove, his back against the log wall, his wet shirt clinging to his shoulders. He pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them, a solitary figure watching the fire, giving her space. But the cold was relentless. It was a living thing, a predator. Mercy's shivers became violent spasms, shaking the very floorboards. She felt a primal fear, a terror that she would simply freeze, that her body would just shake itself apart in this dark, forgotten place. And mixed with the cold was the deeper, older fear, the memory of lying in her room above the saloon, listening to Croft at the door, feeling utterly alone and helpless. A small, desperate sound escaped her lips. Jed's head snapped up. In the flickering firelight, he saw her face, pale and strained, her eyes wide with a misery that was more than just physical. She took a ragged breath, the words torn from her. "Just hold me," she whispered, her voice trembling as much as her body. The plea was so quiet it was almost lost in the howl of the wind. "Please, just let me know someone won't hurt me." It was not a woman's request for a lover. It was a child's plea for a father, a lost soul's prayer for a guardian. She wasn't asking for passion. She was asking for sanctuary. She was asking for the simple, undeniable proof of a safe human presence. Jed did not move for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the cabin stretched taut, thick with the drumming of the rain and the weight of her words. He was a man built of walls, a fortress of solitude. To do what she asked would be to breach his own defenses, to step onto a ground more treacherous than any badland trail. He looked at her, huddled in a miserable ball, and saw not the woman who had captivated his attention in the saloon, but the terrified girl who had whispered her secrets to him in the alley. He saw the honor she had fought so desperately to protect, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not refuse. He rose slowly, his movements stiff. He moved to the pallet and lay down on his side beside her, on top of the blanket, facing her. He was careful to leave a sliver of space between them. The warmth from his body reached across the gap, a tangible promise. She didn't uncurl. Her shivering only seemed to intensify. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that felt as if it took all the strength he possessed, he reached out his arm. He didn't press his body against hers. He didn't try to pull her close. He simply laid his arm over her shoulders, over the thick wool of the blanket. His hand rested lightly on her upper arm, a solid, steady weight. It was a gesture devoid of intimacy, yet it was the most profoundly intimate act of his life. It was a shield, a promise. "I am here. You are safe. I will not hurt you." Beneath his hand, he felt the violent tremors begin to subside. The frantic, desperate shaking eased, replaced by a softer, gentler trembling. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, a sound of such profound relief that it seemed to carry with it months of fear and tension. She did not move closer, did not press against him. She simply accepted the shelter of his arm. Within minutes, the rhythm of her breathing changed, deepening into the slow, even cadence of sleep. She had found her safe harbor. She slept. He did not. Jedediah Carter lay awake in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet sound of the girl's breathing beside him. His arm, draped over her, felt unnaturally heavy, a brand of responsibility he had never sought. He stared into the darkness, the flickering light from the stove casting dancing shadows on the rough log walls. He was no longer just a man running. He was a man protecting, and he knew, as he lay there with the weight of her trust resting on him, that his solitary, untethered life had just ended. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. Water dripped from the eaves of the old cabin and from the needles of the pines, each drop catching the nascent sunlight like a tiny diamond. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine, a scent of renewal. Inside, Mercy woke slowly, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She had not slept the shallow, fearful sleep of the hunted. She had fallen into a deep, dreamless abyss of exhaustion, anchored by the solid, steady weight of the stranger's arm. She became aware of it now. As consciousness returned, his arm was still draped over her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Sometime in the night, she had shifted, turning slightly toward him, her head resting near the curve of his chest. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He was still asleep. A profound and terrifying vulnerability washed over her. She was closer to this silent, unnamed man than she had ever been to another human being. She could see the dark stubble on his jaw, the faint scar that bisected his eyebrow, the way his dark lashes rested against his cheek. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened, the weariness erased. He looked peaceful, a quiet part of her, a part she had thought long dead, wished that this moment in this broken-down cabin could last forever. Carefully, so as not to wake him, she wriggled out from under his arm. The loss of his warmth was immediate and acute. She rose and went to the stove, adding a few small pieces of wood to the glowing embers. The fire caught quickly. She stood before it, her back to him, her cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the flames. The events of the night replayed in her mind the terrifying cold, her desperate plea, his silent, solid response. He had asked for nothing. He had simply given her the one thing she needed most, a feeling of safety. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned. Jed was awake, sitting up. He was pulling on his boots, his movements stiff. He did not look at her. The invisible wall between them was back in place, as if the night had never happened. The moment of closeness was over, a fleeting dream in the midst of a nightmare. "We should move," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "They might have tracked us this far before the rain hit. The mud will have washed our tracks away, but they'll know the general direction." He went outside to check on Apollo. Mercy took the opportunity to tidy their small shelter, folding the blankets, her hands brushing over the spot where he had lain beside her. When he came back in, his face was grim. "We'll rest here today," he said. "A change of plans. Let the horse recover. The ground is too soft. We'd leave a trail a blind man could follow." The day passed in a quiet, domestic rhythm that felt strangely normal. Jed repaired a broken strap on his saddlebag, his hands moving with practiced skill. Mercy, finding a small, leaky bucket, cleaned the inside of the cabin as best she could, sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom of pine needles. They were playing house in the middle of a war. The unspoken tension from the previous night remained, a low hum beneath the surface of their silence. It was late in the afternoon when it happened. Jed was outside, checking Apollo's hooves. Mercy was inside, patching a tear in his coat with a small sewing kit she'd had in her bundle. The world was peaceful. The only sounds, the chirping of a wren and the soft whisper of the wind through the pines. Then, Apollo let out a sharp, nervous snort. Mercy looked up from her sewing. Through the empty window, she saw Jed freeze, his head snapping up. He was staring intently back down the trail they had come up. He stood utterly still for a long moment. Then he moved with a sudden, explosive speed that stole her breath. He burst back into the cabin, his face a mask of cold fury. "They're here," he said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. Two of them. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Mercy. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was back in the saloon, with Croft's greasy voice in her ear. Jed grabbed her by the arm, his grip hard, pulling her to her feet. No time. His eyes darted around the small room, assessing, calculating. He shoved the broken table aside. Behind it, a section of the log wall was different. It was paneled with rough-hewn planks, likely a later repair. He gripped the edge of one and pulled. It came away with a groan of rotten wood, revealing a shallow recess between the inner and outer logs, a space filled with old leaves and cobwebs. "Get in," he commanded, pushing her toward the opening. "Whatever you hear, you don't make a sound. You don't come out. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She scrambled into the dark, cramped space. It smelled of damp earth and spiders. Jed handed her something heavy and cold. It was the smaller pistol from his saddlebag. "I showed you how to use a knife," he said, his voice rapid fire. "This is easier. You point it, you pull the trigger. You don't think, only if they find you. Only then." He pushed the plank back into place, plunging her into near-total darkness. A thin sliver of light shone through a crack, and she pressed her eye to it, her entire world shrinking to that tiny, terrifying view. She heard voices outside, rough and angry. "I tell you, Harlan, the tracks ended here. This is the place." "Shut up, Pike. Let me look." The cabin door was kicked open with a loud bang that made Mercy jump. Two men stepped inside, dripping with mud. One was a big, barrel-chested man with a thick beard, Harlan. The other, Pike, was weaselly and thin, with eyes that darted around the room. They both held pistols. Jed was not in sight. He had melted into the shadows near the stove. "Well, well," Harlan boomed, his eyes falling on the still smoldering fire. "Looks like our little birds have been nesting." He took a step further into the room. "Come on out. Girlie Croft wants a word with you. And as for you, Cowboy, he wants a piece of your hide." Silence. "Maybe they ain't here," Pike whispered nervously. "They're here," Harlan growled. "I can smell 'em." He took another step, and that's when Jed moved. He stepped out from the shadows, his Colt seeming to appear in his hand as if by magic. "That's far enough," he said, his voice as cold as a grave. Both men spun around, startled. Pike let out a yelp of surprise. "So, there you are," Harlan sneered, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He began to raise his pistol. Jed's gun bucked in his hand, the explosion deafening in the small cabin. Harlan was thrown backward as if punched, a dark, round hole appearing in his chest. He hit the floor with a heavy, final thud. It happened so fast Mercy could barely process it. But Pike reacted. As Jed was focused on Harlan, Pike fired his own pistol. A searing pain shot through Jed's left arm. He grunted, stumbling back a step, his sleeve suddenly turning dark with blood. Pike saw his chance. Instead of firing again, he let out a wild cry and charged forward, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. He was too close for Jed to get a clear shot. Jed brought his Colt up to pistol-whip the man, but his wounded arm was weak, the movement clumsy. Pike crashed into him. They went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling on the dirt floor. Jed was bigger, stronger, but the wound in his arm was bleeding freely, and his movements were hampered. Pike was wiry and quick, fighting with a desperate, cornered rat ferocity. Through the crack, Mercy watched in horror. She saw the flash of the knife. Jed grunted in pain as the blade sliced across his ribs, a shallow but painful cut. He managed to grab Pike's wrist, holding the knife at bay, but his strength was failing. Pike was pushing the blade closer and closer to Jed's throat. Jed's face was pale, strained with effort, his teeth gritted. He was losing. A terrible, cold clarity washed over Mercy. Jed's words echoed in her head. "Point it! Pull the trigger! Don't think!" Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the pistol. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She raised it, trying to aim through the tiny crack. She could see Pike's back, the strained fabric of his shirt. She could see Jed's face, his eyes locking with hers for a fraction of a second through the crack. There was no plea in them, only a grim acceptance of his fate. That look broke through her fear. She closed her eyes, squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded in a blast of fire and noise. The recoil slammed her back against the wall of the recess. Her ears rang, and the smell of gunpowder filled her small space. She opened her eyes. Pike had arched his back, a look of pure, dumb shock on his face. He made a strange, gurgling sound and slumped sideways. The knife fell from his hand, clattering on the floor. Jed, using his last ounce of strength, shoved the man's limp body off him. Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the sound of two people gasping for breath. Jed pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the wall, his left arm held tightly to his side. He looked at Pike's body, then at Harlan's. Then his gaze moved to the plank wall. Slowly, her limbs feeling like lead. Mercy pushed the loose board away and stumbled out into the room. The sight of the two dead men on the floor, of the blood, made her stomach heave. The heavy pistol slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the dirt with a soft thud. She stood there, trembling from head to toe, in the middle of the carnage she had helped create. Jed didn't speak. He just looked at her. He was breathing heavily, his face pale with pain and blood loss. She was breathing just as hard, her lungs aching, her body shaking with shock and the aftermath of terror. Their eyes met across the small, death-filled room. And in that moment, everything changed. He wasn't just a stranger anymore, and she wasn't just a girl he was helping. They were something else entirely. They were two people who had just walked through the fire together. He looked at her not with gratitude, not with pity, but with a raw, stark intensity she had never seen before. He was seeing the woman who had just saved his life, and she was seeing the man for whom she had just taken one. There was no turning back. The world they had known before, the separate lives they had lived, had been burned away in a flash of gunpowder, leaving only the two of them, breathless and bound together in the quiet, violent aftermath. The ringing in Mercy's ears slowly subsided, replaced by the harsh, ragged sound of Jed's breathing. He was leaning against the log wall, his face a ghastly shade of pale under its layer of grime. The dark stain on his left sleeve was spreading, and a new, uglier red was soaking through his shirt along his ribs. The metallic, coppery smell of blood filled the small cabin, a sickening perfume that mingled with the lingering scent of gunpowder. For a long moment, they both remained frozen in the tableau of violence, caught in the stunned silence that follows a storm. Then, the training Jed had given her, the lessons in pure survival, kicked in. The terror receded, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He was hurt. He needed her. She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. "Your arm," she said, her voice a cracked whisper. He looked down at it as if noticing it for the first time. "It's nothing." "It is not nothing," she insisted, a new and unfamiliar authority in her voice. She went to their meager supplies and found a clean rag from her bundle. She ripped it into strips. She approached him cautiously, as one might approach a wounded wolf. "Let me see." He didn't protest. He was watching her, his eyes dark and intense, tracking her every movement. He had seen her fear, and now he was seeing this new, fragile strength emerge from its wreckage. With fumbling, trembling fingers, she pushed up his sleeve. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the flesh of his forearm. It was bleeding badly, but seemed to have passed clean through. They worked in a grim, silent partnership. She washed the wound with water from the canteen, her touch surprisingly gentle. He gritted his teeth, his only sound a sharp intake of breath when she cleaned the debris from the edges of the wound. She bound it tightly with the strips of cloth, her hands slowly steadying as the task consumed her focus. She did the same for the shallower knife wound on his side. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, her hands stained with his blood. The adrenaline was fading, and a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion was taking its place. Now that he was tended to, the reality of the two bodies on the floor crashed back in on her. She had shot a man. She had taken a human life. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she had to close her eyes, her head swimming. A calloused hand touched her shoulder. She flinched, her eyes flying open. It was Jed. He had moved to sit beside her. His touch was light, his fingers barely making contact. "You did what you had to do." "Mercy," he said, his voice low and rough. "You saved my life." The words were a simple statement of fact, but they landed on her like a benediction. He wasn't recoiling from her. He wasn't treating her like a monster. He was looking at her with a stark, raw respect that made her feel as if she could breathe again. She gave a small, jerky nod, unable to speak. They couldn't stay. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb, with a shared, unspoken understanding. They set about the grim task of cleaning up. Jed, moving slowly and favoring his left side, dragged the bodies out into the woods. He did not let her help with that part. While he was gone, she scrubbed the floor with dirt and water, trying to erase the dark stains that had soaked into the earth. By the time he returned, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red. "We ride at first light," he said. They traveled for 2 more days, moving steadily southeast. A new dynamic had settled between them. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the comfortable, worn silence of 2 people who had passed through a crucible and needed no words to understand each other. She rode behind him, her arms around his waist. But now her grip was not one of fear, but of steady presence. She would often check his bandages, retying them when they came loose, and he would accept her care with a quiet acquiescence that was more eloquent than any thank you. On the evening of the 2nd day, they crested a low hill, and Jed pulled Apollo to a stop. Below them lay a small, sheltered valley. A patch of impossible green nestled in the arms of the surrounding brown hills. A narrow creek, lined with cottonwood trees, snaked its way through the center of the valley floor, and sitting in the middle of it all, looking small and lonely, was a cabin. It was in a state of disrepair, much like the one they had just left. But this place felt different. It didn't feel haunted by failure. It felt like it was waiting. A section of the roof had collapsed, and the rail fence surrounding a small paddock had mostly fallen down. But the log walls of the cabin itself looked solid, and the stone chimney stood tall and straight. There was an air of peace about the place, a sense of deep, abiding quiet. "What is this place?" Mercy whispered. Jed stared down at the valley for a long time before he spoke. "I found it a few years back," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking of a dream he once had. "The man who built it died of a fever. His wife went back east. The land was for sale. Good water from the creek. Soil's decent. It's protected." He paused, and she could feel the tension in his shoulders. This was more than just a place to him. "I thought about buying it," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Thought about trading the trail for a piece of ground, raising horses, a place to—" "Stop," he said the last word as if it were a foreign concept. "Why didn't you?" she asked softly. He was silent for a moment. "A man like me, you get used to moving. You forget how to stand still." He nudged Apollo, and they started down the gentle slope into the valley. As they drew closer, she could see the details. Wild roses grew in a tangled thicket against the cabin's south wall. their blossoms a splash of defiant pink. The grass in the valley was thick and green. It felt like a secret garden, a world away from the dust and violence they had left behind. Jed dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He ran a hand over the weathered logs, his touch almost a caress. He was saying hello to an old, forgotten dream. Mercy slid down from the horse and stood, taking it all in. She looked at the broken roof, the sagging fence, the weeds that choked what was once a garden. She saw the immense amount of work it would take to make this place whole again. She saw the hardship, the struggle, and she felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace settle over her for the first time in her life. Jed turned to look at her, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. He had brought her here, to this place of his abandoned hopes, but he had not asked her to stay. He was showing her a crossroads. Nothing more. He was giving her a choice. And in that moment, Mercy smiled. It was not the tight, nervous twitch of her lips she had used in the saloon. It was not a smile of fear or appeasement. It was a small thing, a slight upturn of her lips, but it reached her eyes, chasing away the shadows that had lived there for so long. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. It was the first real smile Jed had ever seen on her face, and it struck him with more force than any bullet. She walked toward him, her steps light on the green grass. She stopped in front of him and looked up into his tired, wounded face. "It doesn't need to be a castle, Jed," she said, her voice soft but clear as a ringing bell. "Just a place where you are too." Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of disbelief, of wonder, of a hope he had long since buried. He had spent his life believing he was meant to be alone, a solitary wanderer. And here was this girl, this slip of a thing he had pulled from the jaws of hell, offering him a reason to stop. He didn't answer with words. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all she needed. Their new life began the next day. It was a life built of sweat and toil. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their shared purpose a silent language between them. Jed, favoring his healing arm, taught her how to use an axe, how to fell the deadfall pines on the hillside and trim them into logs to patch the roof. She, in turn, learned quickly, her body growing stronger, her hands becoming calloused. They mixed mud and straw and chinked the gaps between the logs of the cabin, their hands working side by side. They rebuilt the fence, post by post, creating a safe enclosure for Apollo. They cleared the weeds from the old garden plot, turning over the rich, dark soil, preparing it for the small bag of seeds Jed had in his saddlebags. There was a quiet joy in the labor. Every repaired log was a victory. Every new fence post was a declaration. They were not just building a home, they were building a life, a future, out of the wreckage of their pasts. They ate simple meals of roasted rabbit and the wild onions she found growing by the creek. They sat by the fire in the evenings, tired and sore, but filled with a deep, quiet satisfaction. One evening, about a week after they had arrived, Jed came into the cabin after watering the horse. The main room was clean. The fire was lit in the newly repaired hearth, and a pot of something that smelled like rabbit stew was simmering over the flames. He stopped in the doorway. On the rough hand-hewn mantelpiece above the hearth, something new had appeared. It was a small, square piece of linen, neatly folded. It was from her small bundle of possessions. He walked closer. She had placed a smooth, flat river stone on it to hold it in place. He picked it up. It was a simple handkerchief, worn soft with age. And in one corner, in small, careful stitches of dark blue thread, she had embroidered two names. Jedediah. Mercy. He stood there for a long time, the piece of cloth in his hand. He ran his thumb over the stitches, feeling the texture of her work. She had not just used his trail name. She had used the formal, solid name of a man who builds a home, the name of a man who stays. It was not a flag of surrender. It was a flag of settlement, a quiet, undeniable claim. He looked across the room. She was standing by the table, pretending to be busy arranging a small jar of wildflowers, her back to him. She had not said a word. She had not looked at him. She had simply left this offering for him to find, a silent testament to the choice she had made, to the home she had found not in the valley, or in the cabin, but with him. He carefully folded the handkerchief and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, the one closest to his heart. Then he walked over to the fire and began to stir the stew. She didn't have to look. She heard his footsteps, and she knew he had seen it. She knew he understood. Weeks turned into a month. The raw wound of their flight from Purgatory Creek began to scar over, replaced by the rhythm of work and the deep, healing quiet of the valley. The hole in the cabin roof was patched with new-cut logs and sealed with mud and sod. The fence around the paddock stood straight and true. In the small garden plot, the first tender green shoots of corn and beans were pushing their way up through the dark. Rich earth, tiny flags of a hopeful future. Their life was a silent dance of shared tasks and comfortable spaces. He never crowded her, and she never pried, yet they were rarely more than a few feet apart. When he split wood, she would be nearby, weeding the garden. When she kneaded dough for their simple bread, he would be at the table, cleaning his colt with meticulous, focused movements. They had built more than a cabin. They had built a world, a fortress against the one that had tried to break them both. But a different kind of storm had been gathering, a quiet, internal tempest of unspoken feelings and unresolved tension. The memory of the night in the storm-racked cabin, of his arm over her, of the simple, profound safety she had felt, was a constant presence, and the shared violence that had followed, the act that had irrevocably bound them, had created a new and terrifying intimacy. They were partners in survival, but they remained a man and a woman, living in a space no bigger than a horse blanket, sleeping on separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the hearth. One night, the rain returned. It was not the violent, angry deluge of before, but a soft, steady drumming on the newly repaired roof, a sound that was more of a lullaby than a threat. It shut them in, cocooning them in the warm, fire-lit space they had made their own. The stew was eaten, the tin plates were cleaned. The world outside ceased to exist. Mercy sat on her bedroll, mending a tear in one of her dresses. Across the small room, Jed sat on a low stool he had made, his back to her, focused on a task of his own. The firelight cast his broad shoulders into sharp relief. He was mending one of his worn-out boots, his hands, which she now knew to be both strong enough to fell a tree and gentle enough to tend a wound, moved with a slow, practiced rhythm, pushing and all through the thick leather, pulling the waxed thread taut. She watched the steady, hypnotic movement of his hands. She watched the way the firelight played in his dark hair. A deep, aching tenderness swelled in her chest, so powerful it was almost painful. This man, this silent, solitary man had walked into her life and, without a single pretty word or grand gesture, had given her back her soul. He had taken nothing, and he had offered everything: safety, respect, a home. He had treated her honor, the thing she had whispered to him in the dark of that cave, as a sacred trust. And she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and true as the bedrock beneath the valley, that she wanted to give him more. She wanted to bridge the final, silent gap between them. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm that matched the drumming of the rain on the roof. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to assert itself. It was the fear of a lifetime of being told what she was worth, of what men wanted from her. But another feeling rose to meet it, a feeling born in the smoky cabin when she had fired that pistol, a feeling nurtured in the sun and soil of this valley. It was courage, her own. She set her sewing aside. The needle and thread lay forgotten on the blanket. She rose to her feet, her movements silent on the packed earth floor. He did not turn. So engrossed was he in his work. She crossed the small space that separated them, each step a monumental act of will. She stopped just behind him. She could feel the warmth radiating from his back. She could smell the familiar scent of him wood smoke, leather, and the clean, honest scent of hard work. She raised a trembling hand. For a moment, it hovered in the air, a pale bird in the firelight. Then, she let it come to rest on his shoulder. The touch was feather-light, barely there. Jed went utterly still. The awl in his hand froze mid-stitch. Every muscle in his body seemed to lock. He had faced down gunmen and storms without flinching. But this small, gentle touch from this girl had struck him with the force of a physical blow. Mercy did not pull her hand away. She left it there, a quiet claim, an offering. She took a deep, shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice was a whisper, meant only for him and the fire and the rain outside. "You don't have to love me, Jedediah," she said, her voice catching on his name. "I don't know if you even can." She paused, gathering her strength. "But if you want to keep me, I'll let you keep me." The words were an echo of her desperate plea in the alley, but their meaning was transformed. Then, she had been begging for escape. Now, she was offering a home. She was giving him the final, most precious piece of herself, not as payment for a debt, but as a gift, freely and completely given. She was giving him the right to stay. Slowly, deliberately. Jed set the boot and the awl down on the floor beside him. He turned on the stool, not just his head, but his entire body, to face her. He looked up at her, his face shadowed and unreadable, his dark eyes searching hers in the flickering light. Her hand slipped from his shoulder, but he caught it before it fell, his large, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. He looked at her, at the fierce, fragile hope in her eyes, at the woman she had become, the woman who had faced down terror and violence, who had built a home with her own 2 hands, who now stood before him, offering him a future he had never believed he could have. For the first time since she had met him, his own voice was not a rough rasp, but a low, raw whisper, freighted with an emotion she could not name but felt in the deepest part of her soul. "Mercy," he breathed her name like a prayer. "I've been keeping you since that first night. You just didn't know it." He rose to his feet, still holding her hand, and drew her gently toward him. He was so much taller than her, and for a moment she felt small, but not afraid. He lifted his other hand, the one that was not wounded, and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking softly against her cheek. He looked down at her, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were seeing not just her face, but the very heart of her. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or practiced skill. It was slow. It was clumsy. It was the hesitant, uncertain meeting of 2 people who had forgotten how, or had never known. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and rain and a deep, unspoken loneliness. It was questioning and tentative. And then, as she leaned into him, as her free hand came up to rest on his chest, it became something else. It became real. It was a promise, a confirmation, a silent answer to a question they had both been too afraid to ask. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, and they stood that way for a long moment, simply breathing each other in, while the fire crackled and the rain pattered on the roof. He did not push her, did not demand anything more. He simply waited, his eyes asking the final question. And Mercy answered. She took his hand and led him the few short steps to her bedroll by the fire. She knelt and drew him down with her, in the warm, golden light. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes, and there was no fear left. None at all. That night, in the quiet solitude of the home they had built together, she was no longer a virgin, but it was not a thing that was taken from her. It was not a debt being paid or a price being extracted. That first time was hers. She chose. She gave. And Jedediah Carter kept it, as gently and as reverently as if he were keeping a sacred oath. The transformation of the valley was a quiet miracle, worked one day at a time. The sun, which had once been a merciless adversary, was now a partner, coaxing green life from the soil of their garden. The creek, which had once been just a source of water, was now a provider of melody, its constant murmur a backdrop to their new life. A month after the violence in the woods, the raw edges of their existence had been smoothed away, replaced by the comforting patina of routine and domesticity. The cabin was no longer a derelict shell, but a home. Mercy had found an old crate and filled it with wildflowers, which sat on the windowsill, a splash of vibrant color against the weathered gray logs. The shelves Jed had built were stocked with a few precious supplies, a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, jars of dried herbs she had gathered. It was a sparse existence, but it was theirs, and it felt richer than any life she had ever known. She had changed. The haunted, fearful girl from the Golden Spur was a ghost, a half-remembered dream. The sun had kissed her pale skin, leaving a dusting of freckles across her nose. Her hands, once soft and trembling, were now strong and capable, calloused from the garden and the axe. She moved with a new confidence, her back straight, her steps sure on the earth she now considered her own. Their small world had even expanded, albeit slightly. A few miles down the creek, in a similar sheltered valley, lived a widower named Aaron and his 7-year-old son. Aaron was a quiet, weary man who had come west to escape the ghosts of his past. Much like them, he was a good neighbor, keeping his distance but willing to trade a brace of quail for a bit of flour. His son, Daniel, was a shy, tow-headed boy who had taken an immediate shine to Mercy. On this particular afternoon, the late sun slanted through the cottonwood trees, painting long, golden stripes across the valley floor. Mercy was sitting on the porch steps, showing Daniel how to braid blades of grass into a long, green rope. The boy was utterly absorbed, his small fingers fumbling but determined. Jed was in the newly fenced paddock, working with Apollo, his voice a low, soothing murmur as he ran a brush over the horse's sleek buckskin coat. A pot of beans simmered over the hearth inside, and the comforting smell of baking bread wafted from the small clay oven they had built beside the cabin. It was a scene of such profound peace, it felt as if it had been lifted from a dream. The sound, when it came, was an intrusion, a note of discord in their quiet symphony. It was the unmistakable sound of an unfamiliar horse, its shod hooves clopping on the rocky trail that led down into the valley. Instantly, the peace was shattered. Jed went still, the brush frozen in his hand. His head came up, his body tensing, every line of him alert. He was no longer a man tending his horse. He was a sentinel, his gaze fixed on the top of the trail. Mercy's hands also stilled, the half-finished grass braid forgotten. She instinctively pulled Daniel a little closer to her side. A moment later, a rider appeared, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky. He was a stranger, a lanky man on a tired-looking sorrel. He was dressed in the dusty, trail-worn garb of a prospector or a cattle scout, a man who lived in the saddle. He rode with a casual slouch, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the tidy cabin, the solid fence, the smoke curling from the chimney. He looked surprised to find such a well-tended place in the middle of nowhere. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch. Jed moved out of the paddock, wiping his hands on his trousers. He didn't walk toward the man. He simply moved to the center of the yard, positioning himself between the stranger and the cabin, a silent, immovable obstacle. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He just waited, his right hand hanging loose, preternaturally close to the worn grip of the Colt on his hip. "Howdy," the stranger said, his voice a dry rasp. He nodded at Jed. Didn't expect to find folks settled in this deep. Jed didn't reply. His silence was a wall, more intimidating than any threat. The stranger shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was used to the codes of the trail, and this man's silence was a clear and unwelcoming sign. He licked his chapped lips. "Name's Calloway. Just scouting for water and graze. I passed through a town a week or so back, place called Purgatory Creek." At the name, a cold dread snaked its way up Mercy's spine. She felt Daniel tense beside her. She put a calming hand on his small shoulder. "Heard a story there," Calloway continued, his curiosity getting the better of his caution, "about a fella who lit out of town with some of Silas Croft's property. A girl." He squinted, his gaze flicking from Jed's stony face to the cabin, as if trying to see through the walls. "Heard a rumor you might be the fella, that you might be harboring the girl from the saloon." The words, spoken so casually, landed in the peaceful yard like a dropped stone, shattering the quiet surface of their life. The girl from the saloon, it was a brand, a label that sought to drag her back into the filth and fear of her past, to erase everything she had become. Inside the cabin, Mercy felt a familiar, cold tremor begin in her hands. It was the ghost of the girl who had held the shaking tray. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, she was back in that smoky room, with the leering faces and the grabbing hands. But then she looked down at the top of Daniel's head, at his sun-bleached hair. She looked at the sturdy log walls of the home she had helped build, and she looked at Jed. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his right hand had lifted, ever so slightly, and now his thumb rested gently on the hammer of his Colt. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was the calm, deadly certainty of a rattlesnake coiled to strike. His eyes, fixed on Calloway, were as flat and cold as river stones in the dead of winter. He was a statue of lethal intent, and the entire valley seemed to be holding its breath around him. And, in that moment, something inside Mercy clicked into place. The last vestiges of the frightened girl burned away, consumed by a fierce, protective fire. This was her home. That was her son's friend beside her, and that was her man standing in the yard, ready to die to protect her. She would not hide. She would not cower. She would not let this stranger, this voice from a dead past, define her. She rose to her feet with a smooth, unhurried grace. She smoothed the front of her clean calico apron, a simple, domestic gesture that was also an act of defiance. She took Daniel's small hand in hers, his fingers curled around hers, trusting and warm. She walked out of the cabin and onto the porch, her chin held high. She did not stop on the steps, but walked down into the yard, stopping a few feet beside Jed, placing herself squarely in the stranger's line of sight. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, thick braid. Her dress was clean. Her eyes were clear and direct. Calloway's gaze shifted to her, his eyes widening in surprise. This was not the broken, weary creature he had imagined from the saloon gossip. Mercy looked the man directly in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and steady as the creek that ran through their valley. It carried across the quiet yard with an authority that was absolute. "My name is Mercy Carter," she said, her grip tightening on the boy's hand, "and I am that man's wife." The words were simple, but they were a shield and a sword. Carter! She had claimed Jed's name, forged it into her own identity. Wife. It was a declaration of belonging, of a sacred bond that no grubby rumor from a place like Purgatory Creek could ever touch. The stranger, Calloway, stared at her for a long moment. He saw the unwavering steel in her eyes. He saw the boy holding her hand, then his gaze flicked back to Jed, to the thumb resting on the hammer of the Colt, to the death that was waiting patiently in the man's cold eyes. A slow flush crept up the man's neck. He had made a terrible mistake. He had walked into a church and cursed at the altar. He snatched his hat from his head. "Ma'am," he stammered, his trail-worn arrogance completely gone. "Mrs. Carter, my apologies. I was misinformed." He backed his horse up a few steps, his movements clumsy. I'll be on my way. I won't trouble you again." He wheeled the tired sorrel around and spurred it back up the trail, not looking back. He rode as if the devil himself were on his heels. Mercy and Jed stood in the yard, watching until the rider was a small speck on the horizon, until the sound of his horse had faded completely into the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. The dust he had kicked up settled slowly back to the earth, the peace of the valley, tested and proven, returned, deeper and stronger than before. Jed finally relaxed, his hand falling away from his pistol. He turned his head and looked at her. The setting sun bathed them in a warm, golden light. His face, which had been a mask of cold fury, softened. He looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him, who had fought this battle with her own words, with her own strength. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, and in the quiet depths of his eyes, she saw it all. Pride, respect, a love so profound and unwavering it needed no voice. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a confirmation. It was a vow. It was everything. She was not the girl from the saloon. She was not her father's debt. She was not a fugitive hiding in the shadows. She was Mercy Carter. She was the present. She was his love. She was the wife that Jedediah Carter had chosen, and she was, finally, completely, home. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts with you. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.